Hello and welcome to the big video of the year. This is my best books of 2024. Now, this year has been a fantastic year. It's been a massive year, both, as I said, in terms of reading, but also in terms of what I've been doing with myself. At the start of this year, I didn't even have this YouTube channel. I didn't have, I don't think, a TikTok. All of that sort of stuff has started in 2024, and that's where I've continued to grow. At the start of the year, I only had a few thousand followers on Twitter, and now there's quite a few more of people over there. Blue Sky wasn't a big thing. I mean, it was a thing, but it wasn't a big thing, and now it's a much bigger thing. It's been a huge year for this personally, me, but also reading. And we're all here to talk about reading. So what I'm going to do is I have like over 20 books that I could not narrow down any further to anything less. What essentially I did is I went onto my story graph, looked at my stats, and had a look at which books I'd rated 4.5 or above. There are only 3 books that I read in the entire year that I stuck within my 4.75 rating. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean those are the 3 books in my top 3. And that's a very odd thought. And the idea behind this is how I now feel about them, how I think about them in hindsight. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a review, or you've just finished a book, you're kind of filled with the emotion, you're filled with the awe, that sort of thing. And then you kind of, I don't know, have months to kind of study it and think about it and read more and think, okay, actually this was better or that was better. But at the time, maybe you read this better book, you had been reading great books. So you're like, I can't give all of these 4.75, so I had to give one a 4.5. So that's how I think I've kind of come to this conclusion that the 3 best books on Storygraph, well, aren't necessarily going to be my 3 best books in this list. There are a few books I want to give honourable mentions to. These are books that I was like, I need to talk about how good these are. I can't keep them off this list. So they're on this list. And then we're going to go into my top 10. Now, frustratingly, there are 2 books in my top 10 that actually aren't with me right now. I lent them to somebody and they've not given them back. And I can't get them back. And I just wanted to get this video recorded. So that's fine. I'll just do like a pow. There's a book. Anyway, hope you enjoy this video. Let's get into it. So my first honourable mention is The Well of Ascension with Brandon Sanderson. If you know me at all, you know I'm the biggest Brandon Sanderson fan. Absolutely love pretty much everything that he writes. The way he writes is incredibly engaging, it's incredibly forward, it's incredibly approachable. And that's what I love about him and his books, and that's what I love about The Well of Ascension, which is the second book in, if you didn't know, the Mistborn series. If you ever hear anybody talk about Brandon Sanderson, say, start with Mistborn. It's actually a series, it's a trilogy, and then there are some more books after that. There are more trilogies set in different times, but based on the same kind of idea. This is the second book in the first trilogy, the first one being called The Final Empire. So The Well of Ascension picks up exactly after The Final Empire, and everything essentially carries on from what happened in the previous one. Now, the first one could have been a standalone, but Brandon Sanderson's done really well to be like, no, I need to now deal with all the impacts of the incredible story that I wrote in the first one. How am I going to deal with that? He deals with it fantastically in The Well of Ascension, and that's why I needed to give an honourable mention, because it's one of the best fantasy series going at the moment. It's the one that everybody recommends getting into when it comes to Branson, so I thought I needed to give this a mention. I've just seen the top of my book is a little bit janky, which I'm not happy about, but there we go. Anyway, that's The Well of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. The next book is Sea State by J.M. Simpson. I think this is a book that it maybe is absolutely fantastic, but it's a book that I just couldn't quite pull myself to put into my top 10, and I hope you agree when you see what my top 10 book list is. The Sea State follows a really cool kind of little story, and it's actually a debut novel from Joe, who is Jay in J.M. Simpson, and it follows the idea of 2 people who have essentially got lives going on. So there is, let me remember their names, Doug and Jessie. Jessie has basically come from a job where she had a horrible thing happen to her and she left, and she's now moved away and she started this new job at the same place that Doug works. Doug is struggling with his home life. His children are absolutely obsessed with him and he's obsessed with them, and the wife just seems to not be that involved and that interested. And it ends up like pulling them together, and at the same time, the people that may have hurt Jessie are possibly still around, and at the end of some of these chapters it's like pulls from their point of view, which literally sucked me in and was fantastic, and I loved it. Great little book, Sea State. If you've not yet heard of it, I really should give it a mention. Joe would love it if I did, because she's quite cool on social as well. So yeah, Sea State by J.M. Simpson is another book on my honourable mentions list. This isn't the top 10 quite yet. Another book, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. I read this very early on in the year. I understood at the time that everybody had pretty much already read it. They read it years ago, hyped about it then, and I thought, well, I'm going to get out of the way, brilliant. Loved it. Loved Eleanor Oliphant as a character. Thought she was fantastic, really funny. I love the story. I love the message. There's kind of two stories going on here. There's the development of Eleanor Oliphant herself into somebody who is on the spectrum, is struggles with social cues, things like this, and therefore meets somebody, or not therefore, but and then meets somebody who helps her with this, who brings her into a situation she's never been in before, who kind of encourages her to do things and come out of her shell and that sort of stuff. And at the same time, we're learning these really dark things about her past and essentially about her mum, which helps her open up as well. Fantastic, loved it. As I said, a lot funnier than I was expecting it to be, but either way, brilliant book. If you've heard of it and not yet picked it up, check it out. The next book is The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn. Now, this is a book, again, I read quite early on in the year. This was actually one of my picks for the books that you suggested I should read throughout the year, and it was fantastic. Thank you so much. Essentially tells the story of a young girl who one day gets a new mum, and the new mum then has a child, and so she has a little stepbrother, and they go off on some journeys together. They find a whalebone carcass on the beach, and they want to turn it into a theatre, but apparently that is owned by the king, but I think they end up getting a theatre anyway. Then they go off to war as adults, so it kind of covers decades. They go off to war as adults or do different jobs. One's literally at war, one's at home, one's abroad, etc. And it talks about their difficulties of growing up and their difficulties of being apart. And it's just very mature, very fantastic. And I always mention when I talk about this book, some brave things that Joanna Quinn did in here. So rather than just writing a novel, word for word, paragraph for paragraph, there are elements in here that are kind of like a newsletter or a letter or a poster or a pamphlet, these sort of things to help build the world and tell the story. And that was really impressive. Big fan of that. Big fan of any time anybody uses just a slightly different element to write a book that they've done throughout the year. So that's The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn. This was one that shocked me towards the end of the year. This was very, very kindly sent to me by somebody over on Instagram who said they were reading, I think, the sequel or the third one in the book, and they said it's fantastic. They're loving it. Can they send me the first one to hear my thoughts on it? 100% I said yes. Picked it up. It started off very odd. So basically the idea is there's an apocalypse happened and it's the end of the world, and every now and then they have something called the less year, which is when things start to come to a halt and they have a whole year where trade is not allowed. So you're not allowed to legally trade with people. Therefore, it creates this chaos for a whole year where people just kind of steal and kill and are like horrible to each other, and it's vile. The story focuses on one boy who's not yet had his first less year, and it's coming up, and essentially that's what happens. It's about a lot of death, it's about family, it's about love, it's about loneliness, it's about humanity, I think is one of the big things here. I think it kind of covers the idea of, okay, if this did happen, if an apocalypse did happen, what kind of person would you want to be in that sort of situation? It had a slow start. I was really struggling with it at the start. I was like, people just keep dying and beating each other up. And I was like, I don't get if there's any story going on. But about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, really picked up. The message started to hit and I became very, very impressed. So that was The Last Year by C.K. Oldfield. I was, surprisingly impressed with this one. So that's why it's in my honourable mentions. The next book is Of Darkness and Light by Ryan Cahill. This is the second book in his series. I'm not too sure what the series is actually called, but this is the second book. They're all thick. They're all fancy, they're all fantastic. Ryan Cahill, if you've not yet had a chance to pick him up and you're a big fancy person, is writing a really quite epic series here. What he does is he manages to write something quite simple, something quite approachable. There's elements of kind of Lord of the Rings, and that he's building this kind of culture as well. There's a lot of dragons in it, which is why there's kind of dragon features. That's not a dragon, I think that's something else. No, that is a dragon on the front cover, and there's a lot of dragons in it, and how they have an impact on the world is really interesting. This kind of synergy between humans and dragons. And the second book carries on from the first, builds upon it, introduces new characters, and has this kind of twist in it where we're talking like best friends are now enemies, and not in like a romance kind of cringe way, but in a way that people actually care. And that's fantastic. Big fan of this. I'm definitely going to be picking up the next book at some point in 2025 because I need like a month to read that one. But that's Of Darkness and Light by Ryan Cahill. If you're a fancy fan and you've not yet heard of this series, definitely check it out. I've forgotten off the top of my head what the first book is, but I'll pop it here. So check that out. The next book is The Rose Code by Kate Quinn. This is a book that I picked up when I went off to Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park is the place where during World War II, the Enigma code was broken using the bomb machine by the likes of Alan Turing and people like this. Essentially geniuses who broke codes. They took years off the end of the war. This book focuses on the women, the Wrens, I think they were called, during the time, who worked in the background, who did a lot of incredibly important work, but arguably didn't get the limelight until the past, I don't know, couple of decades where people have started to talk about them more. What they essentially did is they did the decoding. So they were given the rule, essentially, when it came to the code, and they had to decode, and then they set it there, and they worked disgusting hours. I think it was like 3 weeks on, 1 day off sort of kind of idea. They barely got any time. It focuses on 3 stories. It talks about their time during the war, their time during after the war, what happened during their time during the war. That's a lot of the word during. How that affected them after the war, all this sort of stuff. The word war and during, like, if you're playing a drinking game where I just repeat words, they're the words to pick up on apparently for this book. But either way, really enjoyed it. There's kind of comedic elements in it as well, which I'm always a fan of. There's good story, there's great characters, big personalities, and there's even a little plot twist to throw in there that's like, oh my god, as if this person did that. The Rose Code by Kate Quinn, absolute must read, and that's why it's on my honourable mentions. Freida McFadden is on my honourable mentions. The Housemaid's Secret, the second book in the Housemaid's series. If you've read The Housemaid, this is very, very similar. And that's why I thought, yeah, it's good. You can't say The Housemaid's good and then she does almost the exact same thing here in the sequel and say that's not good, because she has said you can read this as a standalone book. You don't have to have necessarily read the first one. Having read the first one would help you understand some of the things that happen in the second one, but you wouldn't miss anything if you hadn't. Housemaid's Secret, as I said, kind of follows on from the first in kind of chronological order. Our main housemaid has left where she was before and is now in the city and goes to work for somebody different, and things obviously end up going a little bit awry. There's also a personal element in this one, which then builds into the third book, which has come out quite recently, which I wouldn't say is as good. It's just a very different book to what's going on here. There's still your twists and there's still that sort of stuff. And there's an element to the third book where it feels like it's more about the family and more about the things of growing up. But this second book was brilliant. If you like your twists in books and you've not read the first book, I would highly recommend picking this one up. If this is the first one you don't see the first one, pick this one up. You won't miss a lot. Brilliant book. This was a recent one for me. This was The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. This was fantastic. Picked for me again as one of my top books that I should be reading in the year. So I had 12 books. I read them. I'm going to do a separate video on the books you chose for me and which ones I liked the most, that sort of thing. The House on the Cerulean Sea focuses on one chap called Linus who works for a company who essentially goes out and finds children who are magical and puts them in the correct facilities, and also goes across to these facilities and makes sure that they are satisfactory, etc. He then gets given a job that's essentially very different to anything he's ever done before. It's very dark, it's very twisted, it's very not what he's used to, and he has to speak to people who are incredibly senior, and he's like, oh my god, what's going on here? Why am I speaking to these people? And it's about him going off and doing something he's not very comfortable doing. He lives a very lonesome life, he has a cat, he goes home, listens to the same music every night, does the same thing, he's very comfortable doing that. So when he's pushed into this world, and things are changing, and there's people and things he's never understood before, never met before, and they're there, and yeah, I've explained that poorly. I don't want to spoil too much to the plot, but the message here is about inclusion. There are things in this that you could definitely relate to regular human beings, because they're not regular human beings, they're magical human beings. And it's about inclusion. It's about not prejudging people. It's about kind of standing up for what you believe in. And yeah, it's fantastic. It's very heartwarming. There's rarely any kind of drama or scaredness in this. In fact, there's a romantic element as well, which is fantastic. And it's just lovely. It's just a hug in a book. It's fantastic. Brilliant. I don't know how many words at times I could say that, but if you've not yet read The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, I could not recommend it more. If you're looking for something to kind of relax you, to chill you out, to make you feel good, this is a fantastic book. So check it out. And the next book is River East, River West by Aube Ray Lescure. This was a book that was again very kindly sent to me quite early on in the year, and I had absolutely no idea what I was reading here. I was like, I have no idea what I'm going into. Essentially what we've got is the story of a young girl in the mid-noughties China, and then we've got a man in the 1980s China who was young at the time, and he kind of grows throughout the story. She stays the same age and eventually end up meeting and involved in each other's lives. And it's the interesting conversation of both China in itself and its development and its alternative kind of history, but also the story of her being young and experiencing youngness during that time, and how different his youth was, how he developed, and his discussions with her about how to better herself and where to go, that sort of stuff. Really, really interesting book. I was actually really impressed. The writing's fantastic. I found myself reading or wanting to read it so much, and very rarely do I pick up a book where I'm like, I don't really know what's going on here, I don't know where this is going, but I want to keep involved. But River East, River West really did that for me. I think this was actually recently nominated for a few awards as well, so well done, Aube Ray Lescure. Fantastic book. If you've not yet checked it out, if you've never even heard of it, it's being on my honourable mentions should give you the kind of oomph to go out and maybe check it out. So yeah, very, very good. 2024 was the first year I read my first ever Agatha Christie, and I know as a reader that's probably insane for me to say, but also I'm not a reader of a certain decade. There we go. Either way, it was And Then There Were None, which is probably one of the most classic and maybe arguably the most famous of her books in terms of recognisable storylines. The group of people are invited to a mansion by a mysterious figure, and then one by one they are slowly killed off, and that's no surprise. I think anybody could have told you that. Interestingly, there is this riddle within the house that's essentially telling them how they're going to die. They don't work out till quite late that that's what's happening. And also it feels like there's nobody in the house that could be the killer. We don't know who the killer could be, and everyone that seems like the logical choice then ends up dying, and that's probably the best bit of this book. Really, really impressive. I was very, very intrigued, even though we've heard the story 100 times, even though we know what's essentially going to go on. The characters were still interesting. They had enough personality within them that I was still interested in them. Some of them a little bit archaic in the way that they think, but obviously that was the time that the book was written. Just a generally impressive book. If you've never read Agatha Christie and you think, I've got to start somewhere, where should I start? This one's good. It's not mind-blowing. There's nothing about this that's kind of like these interweaving multi-plot things you get sometimes going on in thrillers these days. It's very simple in its context, but you know what you're getting here, and you'll think, wow, so that's where that story came from. So that's And Then There Are None by Agatha Christie, another book on my honourable mentions. So the penultimate book on my honourable mentions list before we get into this top 10 is A Gentleman in Moscow. This is a book that I keep forgetting how much I enjoyed. Whenever I think of what are the best books I've read this year, I just forget this book every single time. But then I remember it, I'm like, oh yeah, I bloody enjoyed that. I picked up A Gentleman in Moscow purely because I didn't have anything to read. Every lunch break, I go for a walk and I listen to my audiobook. Halfway through my lunch break, on my walk, I had no audiobook to listen to. So I was literally like, okay, what have I got? A Gentleman in Moscow was in my library already. I had it on my bookshelf, so I thought, I'll give that a go. Ended up loving it. The gentleman himself is essentially a man that gets stuck into a hotel for a crime that he did. He essentially gets put on house arrest in this hotel. And rather than it being a case of, oh, I'm going to get depressed and horrible in here, he just ends up meeting a load of fun people. He ends up engaging with loads of different people. There are young children that he has great conversations with. There are far travellers. There are people he ends up getting in problems with. And one of my favourite things about the gentleman himself, his account, is essentially he is a very nice person. And the reason it's called A Gentleman in Moscow is because he's a gentleman. Whether you are the lowest cleaning class, not saying cleaning class is the worst, but the people that would generally just be in the background, treats the exact same way as the people he treats at the very, very top. And he despises people that treat them differently. Every human being is the same, and so he treats them the exact same. And that's one of my favourite things about this book. It's lovely. I believe there's some sort of TV series, I don't know whether it's Apple TV or something else, but there's a TV series, I don't know if it's not good, but either way, I might try and give that a go at some point. I was so impressed with this book, I feel like I do want to watch it, even though I think it's Ewan McGregor, and I feel like a little bit like I know who Ewan McGregor is. I didn't want it to be Ewan McGregor, I wanted it to be someone I didn't know so I could think of them as this character. But either way, may give it a go, see what it's like. If you've not yet checked out Gentleman in Moscow and you've heard of it by Immortals, I think he's got a couple of other things, or a couple of other books that are very, very good as well. I definitely recommend this one. I've had a friend read it as well who really enjoyed it. I think a couple of other friends as well who have recommended it too. So Gentleman in Moscow by Immortals. I don't know if I've ever said his surname right or his full name right. Who knows? Either way, check it out. Now, the final book on my honourable mentions very, very nearly got put into my top 10. It was Happy Bloody Christmas by Joe Middleton. Now, I was shocked at how much I enjoyed this. Now, I've talked about this in my last video, so if you've not yet seen my full kind of review of this book, go check that out. But I was just literally sent this by Avon Books saying, we've got a new book, we'd love you to read it. Would you be happy to read it? Yes, loved it. Got the audiobook as well, and it just felt like Christmas. So much so that now I've finished it, I don't think I'm going to feel as Christmassy as I felt reading this at the time. It ticked so many things that it means to be British Christmas. There were Pringles, there were popcorn, there was children eating or drinking a bottle of beer on Christmas Eve. There was the parents drinking wine in the middle of the day. There was board games, there was wrapping, there was decorations, there was popping out for a walk. All of the things that you do as a British person around the Christmas time. So the story is of a woman called Anna Johnson who wakes up after an annual Christmas party and essentially then has a dead Santa in her larder. The whole book is a comedy though. So the dead Santa's there, but it's more of an inconvenience. Like, guys, Christmas Eve. I've got in-laws coming tomorrow. I ain't got time for this. And that's the whole theme of the book. And it had me genuinely laughing out loud listening to the audiobook in my car. That's how genuinely funny it was. I don't want to talk too much more about it because as I said, I've just done a video. So you can check that out, the previous video, to see my full kind of deductions of this book, as it were. But it really was fantastic. And I came out of it with so much emotion. And emotion is what I want from books. I want to feel invested. I want to feel like I could keep listening and keep reading this. If there was a sequel to this, that would have been the next book I'd have read. That's how good this was. So let's now get into my top 10 books. You've watched quite a few books already, but you've not yet seen my very favourite. Now, a couple of these I think aren't in this physical pile again, so I'll just point over there again. Let's get into this list. And these are in order. The honourable mentions weren't in any sort of order. They were just like, hello, here's a book, blah. These are counting down from 10 to 1, with 1 being my favourite book of 2024, of course. So, let's get into it. So in 10th place on my top 10 books of 2024 is Iron Widow by Jiran J. Tsao. You may have seen this book pop up so many times in my videos as one of the books that really, really surprised me after I finished reading it. I was really kindly sent this by somebody over on my TikTok. They essentially said, just wanted to send you a book from your wish list. I'd wished this a while ago because it had a cool front cover and it had some decent reviews and I didn't really know much else about it. Essentially, it's about mecha bots controlled by human beings, only men. The co-pilots are women. The power that empowers these mecha bots is something called chi, which is essentially like your willpower. Chi literally has a figure. Men usually is higher. There's one woman in the main story who's as high as men, and she overthrows men and kills the most powerful mecha bot driver in the world because he killed her sister. Do you get me? It's chaos. It's brilliant. It's action. It's fast-paced. It's written in a way where it's like there's no BS. There's no kind of, I'm going to flounce around doing this for a bit to fill. No, there was just all plot, all pace, all action. Just amazing. Now, it looks a relatively thick book. It's not the thinnest book. It's not kind of thriller thin, but it's only actually just over 300 pages long, or just over 300 pages long. And therefore, you kind of race through it thinking, this is brilliant, keep going, and then it finishes. And the finishing is that fantastic that it was like, it's kind of like that Brandon Sanderson-esque, where it kind of makes you feel like there's something bigger going on. You're like, oh, you know that whole kind of politics you've just been going on about and all the people you've just met? Yeah, there's something way bigger going on up here, bro. And you're about to introduce that in the next book. And I am so excited for the second book in this series. Really, really impressed me, Iron Widow by Jiran J. Tsao. It's just one of those packages, you know, the whole package? The characters have got loads of personality. The story was action-packed. The front cover is stunning. The idea is really cool. It just ticked so many boxes for me. And so I just could not hold off putting this in my top 10 books of 2024. So that's number 10, Iron Widow by Jiran J. Tsao. The next book on this list is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Now, I don't have a physical copy because I've lent this to somebody, but essentially this is a kind of telling of David Copperfield, which I'd never read anyway, so that meant nothing to me. However, this book really shocked me with how dark the matter is. Essentially, it's about a boy that's bounced around in different foster and adoption homes and different parents, and he's got a mother, but she's not particularly reliable. And then essentially, as he grows older, this causes him to have problems and addictions, and he meets somebody who has an addiction, and her addiction is feeding his, and when he tries to get rid of his, she's like, no, you don't love me because you're getting rid of yours. It's dark. But the whole book has an underlying tone of slight humour. Because I think Demon Copperhead's kind of life is so low, his expectations are so low, his kind of expectations of what's a little bit higher are a little bit lower than everybody else's. Therefore, he inlays humour in some of the dark situations. There's quick jokes, there's moments of, oh, well, that's happened again, and it's like a really dark thing that's happened. And I loved that. I was really, really impressed by that. And that was definitely my favourite thing about this book. It was just so impactful. It was so funny in a dark way, and I've got time for dark humour. My favourite type of humour is dark, where you kind of laugh even though you knew you shouldn't laugh because it's not that funny, but because the person that is laughing about it or making the joke can make a joke about it, I do. That's what happens in Demon Copperhead, and I was really impressed by it, and that's why it's the 9th book in my top 10 books as the 9th best book I read in 2024. I sometimes struggle to speak, and that's evident in this video. Book number 8 in my top 10 of 2024 is None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. Now, evidence of this book being fantastic are how many people have lent it to, and therefore the fact it's now kind of, I can't see if you can tell, but it's kind of like skew-whiff. You see how that's kind of bent and the little pages are like absolutely ribbed? It's because the amount of people I lent this to. This is the best thriller I read all year, without a doubt. None of This Is True is about a woman who essentially meets her birth partner or birth twin, not birth partner, birth twin, out when they're kind of like at a pub together. They meet in the bathroom and she kind of introduces herself and she's like, oh, we've got the same birthday. She's like, oh, amazing. And she's like, what do you do? I run a podcast. And the other woman's like, oh, I've got a really cool story actually to talk to you about. My life's really cool. And what ensues is one of the craziest kind of stories I've ever read in a thriller. The amount of twists, the amount of shocks, the amount of kind of tense moments in this book were so impressive. As I said, without a doubt, the best thriller I've read. Lisa Jewell's best thriller. Really, really impressed. Every single person I've lent this to, every person that I know has read it and not had my copy, has also said it's fantastic. They really, really liked it. And I could not include it on this list. Just brilliant. Without a doubt, probably the best thriller I'll ever read. I don't know if anything's going to come close. I'm really, really excited now for Lisa Jewell's next book to see if she can live up to this hype. It was just full of twists. I remember finishing it on my audiobook, again on my lunchtime break. That's how all of my audiobooks tend to happen. And I was walking across the road and it finished. I was literally like, oh my God, amazing. I didn't speak like that, but my mouth was, I was just like, but I wanted to speak. Anyway, that was my reaction to None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell, and that's why it features in my top 10 list. The List of Suspicious Things is the next book on this list, and it's the 7th in my top 10 of 2024, and it's one of the books that actually featured in that top 3 on my story graph that I said is naturally in my top 3, and it's simply because the books that I've put above it, I think since then I've enjoyed more. Simple as that. The List of Suspicious Things is the debut novel from Jenny Godfrey. The first book she's ever written, or the first book she's had mass published anyway. It focuses on the story of Miv, who is a young girl in 1979 Yorkshire during the height of the Yorkshire Ripper. And essentially what she does, she finds out about the Yorkshire Ripper and she's scared about leaving Yorkshire. There's threats of this, so she wants to try and find out who the Yorkshire Ripper is so she can stay in Yorkshire where she's grown up. What she then decides to do is create a list of suspicious things around her, and these are both people and places, and she compiles these. Obviously, she doesn't find the Yorkshire Ripper because we all know what happened there, but what she does do is she ends up kind of unearthing things around her town that made her feel uncomfortable. She unearthed bad people, she unearthed some stories from places, and then about this far in, Jenny Godfrey decides to do this thing that's like, oh my God, this is your debut novel, how dare you do something like that? And it was brilliant. I was really impressed. The whole book's emotional, the whole book down to earth. It feels very Yorkshire in the way that it's written. I lived in Sheffield for a little bit, so I can count myself a little bit Yorkshire. And it was fantastic. Really, really impressed. Stunning front cover, stunning idea, stunning concept, brilliant twist halfway through. Very, very impressed. And that's why it features in my top 10 list of 2024. Let's see how many times I say the word 2024, shall we? The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle is the 6th in my top 10 of 2024. There we go, there it is again. This is a book that I actually finished very, very recently. I really, really was impressed by this. This was my November read of the month, which is another book that you lot picked for me to read. Again, it was brilliant. It tells the story of Albert Entwistle, who gets a letter essentially from his HR department, who works at the post office, saying he must take compulsory retirement. Not a real thing, clearly a fictional thing, but his whole life is the post office. All he knows. All he does is do post and goes home to his cat and lives by himself, and that's it. So when he gets this message, kind of unlocks something in his brain. Albert Entwistle is gay. He's not told people for decades that he's gay. Nobody around him really knows. He's never actioned it, I don't know. But when he was very, very young, he was a little bit more out about it. I don't think he was public with it, but he had a relationship with a boy at the time. What he then decides to do is he decides to take this opportunity of freedom and to go out and essentially find the man of his childhood and see if there's something still there. He knows this man, they had this fantastic relationship, and that's built up really well in the book. Something that if you don't build up well, I don't care if they get to act together, but I did. And that was really well done. Along the way, people accept him, of course, because it's 2023 or 2024, whenever this was written. People are going to accept you. They're not going to care if you're gay. And he even held parties for him and congratulate him. And people that he thought would make jokes and would be dark about it understand it. And I think it's just that kind of element. And it's the big story here is all about, if you kind of interact with people, if you're open about who you are, about what you are, people will then just kind of learn to accept it. One of the biggest things people fear about people being different is just the fear of the unknown. They don't know what to expect from that person. Maybe if they're a straight male and they're scared of gay people is because they're worried all the gay people are going to try and come on to them or they're going to turn them gay. I don't know, there's some underlying thing there. But either way, this is a book about love. This is a book about happiness. This book made me feel so fantastic. It was such a lovely, lovely read. There's barely any moments in here that are kind of tense. There are barely any moments where you feel like deflated. There's no kind of like up, down, up. There are some moments where it was like, oh, what's going on here? But most of it was just joyous happiness. He meets a young lady who's going through a complete story of her own, which is also a brilliant story of acceptance and kind of difference in class as well going on there. It's just a brilliant book. If you've seen this book about and you've not yet picked it up, I would highly, highly recommend it. The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle by Matt Cain. Such a brilliant, brilliant book. And that's why it's number 6 in my top 10 books of 2024. Number 5 on the list is The Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry. What a book. Again, this was similar to another book. I was sent this by somebody who said, this is fantastic. Please read it. I want to hear your views. So I was like, okay, more than happy to. It's a thick boy, so I was a little bit intimidated. For the first, I would say a third, I was a little bit like, this is just a cowboy book. This is just a bunch of cowboys, I don't know, swearing at each other, going about doing cowboy stuff. And I was like, I don't get it. Then things started to click. The characters started to open up. They started to kind of express themselves. The characters who were like just grumpy the whole way through started to, I don't know, cry or get emotional or admit things to people about things you think they didn't like, if that makes sense. And it really opened up for me. The journey then starts to progress. You start to care about these people that have things happen to them. The story covers essentially a few men who decide to travel across the country to try and find a better place to be and live and find things out more about themselves. They find people from their past, they find new people, they fall in love, they fall out of love, they build friendships, they lose friendships, people die. It's brilliant. It's got everything you need in a book. And I think I remember saying that in my full review somewhere, probably on TikTok I spoke about it. It's got every tick box you could need in a book, unless you're looking for a specific genre. It's not got like aliens and robots, but it's got love. It's got a journey. It's got sadness. It's got kind of a character arc. It's got good to bad. It's got bad to good. It's got, I don't know, everything. It's brilliant. It's a fantastic book. Yes, it's long, but it's so worth your time. And it's a book that I had not heard an ounce of before I picked it up. And now anybody says, is it any good? I'd say yes, I would 100% recommend it. Even if you're not into Westerns, even if you're not into cowboys, this is a great book. Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry is number 5 on my top 10 list. Project Hail Mary is a book that I thought was going to be good, but I didn't realize how much I was going to enjoy it. And it's also one of those books where I finished it and said, yeah, that's good. And then about a month later, I was like, that was actually fantastic. What was I thinking that was only good? Project Hail Mary tells the story of a chap called Ryland who essentially wakes up in the middle of space and he doesn't know why he's there, what he's doing, where he is, blah, blah, blah. We then slowly over the time, using flashbacks, start to realize what he's doing up there and the fact that he's there to actually save humanity, but everything is going against him. Without spoiling too much of the plot, there's also a character introduced who is utterly fantastic and really brings out Andy Weir's kind of personality into the book, which I think he's quite famous for. If you want to listen to the audiobook, I would highly recommend that as well. If you're not a big audiobook person, I'd still recommend it. The person that narrates it is fantastic, really adds loads of character and personality into both Ryland and this additional character. It's just a fantastic book. My small minor gripes with this book, I think at the time, were the fact that they just seem to science their way out of everything, which I think is the idea anyway, really. How else would they get out of these situations? But the general story is there's a very, very bad thing happening and they need to solve it and basically science things, bad science things happen and then they work it out. But it's emotional. It's glorious. I know there's a film coming out of it soon. I'm so excited. It is Ryan Gosling, which makes me a little bit nervous because I do prefer to watch films or TV series from books where the character's completely original, but I do have quite confidence because he is quite funny, as we've seen with like the Barbie films, that sort of thing. That's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. If you've heard of this and you've kind of been hesitant about it, just know it is the 4th best book I read in all of 2024. It was fantastic. It was funny. It was fast paced. It finished too quickly. I could have read this twice and still probably not been bored by it. What a book. In a completely different theme, away from being funny, is In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. This is a story of 2 young boys / men who then grow into men. When they're in a private school when they're young, they essentially realise that they are gay. They like each other quite a lot. One of them is the kind of like private school bully. Or I don't know if it is a private school, it's like a little house for boys or something like this, or a school for boys. He's a bit of a bully, so he can't come out. He can't tell people he's gay because then he won't be like seen as the bully. And the other guy is just a small, quiet creature. They then, as I said, fall in love. They have a secret relationship, and then war comes along and separates them. One of them, who the secret, quiet guy, goes off and does something quite senior, quite important. And the other one goes off and does something completely different. It's the story of their time apart, their individual stories, their yearning for each other, and also the story of when they get back together and how the likes of war has affected them both very differently, how their upbringings, all of this sort of stuff affected what their reaction was to the war itself and what their reaction was to after the war. It's fantastic. It's emotional. It's at times horrible. It's called In Memoriam because there's obviously a lot of death, and an In Memoriam is when you write a letter after somebody's died. It's such an emotional book, so brilliant. I remember people recommending it to me, saying it will make you cry. Now, I don't cry at books. I don't know why. I just can't get that emotionally involved into things, but it did make me feel all the feels. It did make me feel sad. It did make me feel like, oh my God, I love these 2 people. I want good things for them. Please give them to me, Alice Wynne. Does she? You'll have to read it to find out. In Memoriam, the 3rd best book I read in 2024. It was so, so good, so deep, so powerful, so well written as well. I don't think I've talked too much about how well written books are in this video, but this is one of the ones that really stood out to me as a brilliant, brilliant book. And I'll be looking for more stuff from Alice Wynne to read. Now, these final 2 books I really probably could not separate that well. I've stuck a second and I've stuck a first, but I could easily swap these around. So what I've stuck in a second is One Day by David Nicholls. Now, if you've ever seen me talk about this throughout the year, you'll know I adored this book. You know this book had an enormous emotional impact on me. And I talked literally just now about how I don't get emotionally involved in books really, just because they don't emotionally impact me that much. But there's a moment in this book where I had to stop reading because I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe that's happened. I want to have a day off to then pick this up later at some other point because it's just that emotional. And a book that when I finished it, I thought, holy crap, what a journey. One Day, if you don't know about it, talks of the story of Dexter and Emma. Dexter and Emma meet after graduation, and they're very two different people. Emma is kind of your quiet, intelligent person at the university, and Dexter is your popular, maybe not as intelligent, kind of emotionally damaged person. And essentially it tells a story over a couple of decades of them getting together, getting apart, meeting up, talking about each of their own individual lives, but also talking about their interrelationship with each other. And it's this kind of on-off kind of thing, and this anger at one another for never being quite good enough for one another and not being quite who they want them to be, but then realizing maybe that is exactly who they want to be. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. It is, as I say in every video that I feature in, the very best form of romance. It's the very best and truest and honest reflection of love and understanding of what being in love truly is. It's not about finding the perfect person. It's not about the other person being horrible and you just falling in love with them anyway because they're beautiful, as we're seeing in a lot of romance books these days. No, it's about two people who are so deeply complex that they find themselves unbearably, that they find themselves unable to just not love each other. And it's just brilliant. It was just so emotionally impactful. One of the best books I've ever read. Absolutely brilliant. It's made me obsessed with anything now that David Nicholls does. I don't know if everything he's written is as brilliant as this is, but this is without a doubt fantastic. The Netflix series, which has got a stupid sticker on it, is brilliant as well, and it's just as emotional. And if you've not read the book, you could watch the Netflix series, but I'd highly recommend reading the book as well, because the way they deal with the moment that made me emotional in the book is probably better than the way they deal with it in the film, TV series even, because it's just brilliant. Yeah. One Day by David Nicholls. Please read this book. And very finally, the best book I've read all year, maybe with a One Day, David Nicholls, is The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. This is, without a doubt, one of the greatest things I've ever read. It tells the story of a young man who is essentially gay in Ireland during the 60s, and you can't be gay in Ireland during the 60s because it's literally, I think, illegal. The police will beat you for it. Everybody hates you for it. You have to do it in secret. And it's essentially his story growing up, trying to hide his homosexuality, but also at the same time allowing himself to kind of involve himself in that world without getting in any sort of trouble, if that makes sense. It's brilliant. In the same way that One Day is the true emotion, kind of true understanding of what love is, what pain is, how difficult life can be sometimes, this is very much that as well. I realise I've actually got quite a few books on this list that feature gay men, and I am not myself a gay man, but I think there's something about hiding who you are and then essentially the world evolving around you to be able to allow you to be that person, or to make you feel more comfortable being that person even, just makes me feel so happy. I love those sort of books. And when they're written well, when they feature characters that I could not forget. There's a very big character in The Heart's Invisible Furies who essentially our main character knows throughout his whole life, and is the reason I think he's gay. Not the reason he's gay because he's gay, but the reason he realises he's gay, and the reason that he keeps kind of coming back to him, and he's like, that's my expectation of what men should be like, and it isn't. There are better people out there. And it's just so emotive, so fantastic. If you've not yet checked it out, I realise I probably walked behind the book a little bit here, but I would highly recommend it. The best book I've read all year, in line with One Day. Two books about just human beings, about their struggles in life, about difficulties, about the rise and the fall. I think I like books where I essentially have an emotional roller coaster. There are bits in this book where it's fantastic. Everything feels good. Everything feels great. Things are picking up. And then there are really dark moments. There are moments literally where you lose people, where the worst thing that can happen to somebody who has opened up or has something with them to happen to them. And it's just horrible. What an emotional roller coaster this book is. If you've not yet read it, I could not recommend it more. So that's my top 10 books and many honourable mentions of 2024. Have you read any of these books? Let me know. This has been a very long video. If you've got to this point in the video, drop a comment, let me know you got this far. Thank you so much for watching this far. It's been an epic. This is going to take me bloody ages to edit, but I'm looking forward to editing it. Probably take me ages to stick on YouTube as well. Either way, drop a like. If you've enjoyed any of the books in this video, if you've read any of these books in the video, if you've had a fantastic reading year in 2024, let me know down in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you always know when I'm posting stuff about books, because I love talking about books. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.